In the heart of a forgotten town, a black female mechanic stops to help a stranded millionaire whose car breaks down on a scorching highway. But what begins as a simple act of kindness unravels a hidden past. Neither of them expected. Everything changes when the man notices the sapphire ring on her finger, a ring he hasn't seen in 20 years. What follows is a shocking reunion, a long-buried family secret, and the fall of an empire built on lies. This is not just a story of injustice, it's a story of truth, reunion, and the unbreakable bond that even time, money, and betrayal couldn't destroy. Stay with us because what you're about to hear will leave you speechless. The sun blazed overhead like a merciless overseer, turning the cracked asphalt of the Brighton Hills back road into a smoldering ribbon of silence and heat. Nothing stirred except the faint shimmer of air rising from the pavement and the mechanical wheezing of a stalled engine under a sleek black Maserati. Ethan Cole, 38 CEO of Coltech, and the face of America's next generation of tech moguls, sat stiffly behind the wheel. His sharp jaw clenched his silk shirt, clinging to his back soaked in sweat. The digital face of his platinum watch blinked 11:43 a.m., exactly 17 minutes until he was meant to be standing before a room of elite investors unveiling Project Helix, the multi-billion-dollar AI complex that would not only cement his legacy, but secure the future of his entire corporation. Yet here he was, alone, stranded and humiliated, watching wisps of steam curl from the hood of his prized car like an omen. He slammed the steering wheel once then again, harder frustration bubbling to the surface like the heat from the engine. No signal, no assistant in range, no nearby service, just him, the broken machine, and the vast emptiness stretching for miles in every direction. With a grunt, he pushed open the door and stepped out, the soles of his leather shoes crunching against gravel as he approached the front of the car. The moment he lifted the hood, a blast of hot vapor struck his face, forcing him to stagger back with a curse. "God damn it," he muttered, tearing at the knot of his tie, the oppressive heat making his custom $3,000 Italian suit feel like a prison. He stared blankly at the tangled mess of wires, pipes, and components, realizing just how little he knew about engines. The great Ethan Cole, who spoke fluently in code and strategy, now utterly defeated by metal and steam. And then, a sound low grinding incongruous with the silence crept into the moment like the first note of a forgotten song. He turned sharply. An old battered pickup truck paint, faded and body dented by time, rolled to a gentle stop a few yards behind him. The door swung open and out stepped a woman, tall, calm, unbothered by the heat. Her skin a deep mahogany, kissed by sun. Her jeans streaked with oil, and a plaid shirt rolled neatly at the sleeves. Her curly hair was pulled back into a functional knot, revealing high cheekbones and a pair of eyes that observed the world, not with judgment, but with certainty. She walked toward him, with measured steps, boots pressing into the earth as if she belonged to it. And before he could speak, she stopped beside the Maserati and said in a tone that made no room for ego, "Need some help?" Ethan blinked, unprepared for the question, his instinct to reject assistance clashing with the desperation tightening in his chest. "I have a meeting in the city in 15 minutes, he replied sharply, not masking his irritation, gesturing toward his useless phone. "My assistant was supposed to send help, but there's no damn signal out here." She didn't flinch, didn't frown, didn't ask for permission. Instead, she leaned over the engine as if the luxury car, the cost of which rivaled a small home, were no more intimidating than a lawnmower. "Cooling system's busted," she said calmly, brushing her fingers across the hot metal with practiced ease. "I can rig it, buy you a couple of hours if you're lucky." Ethan studied her with narrowed eyes, his gaze running over her in calculated scrutiny, but there was no pretense in her stance, no insecurity. "Are you sure?" he asked, more out of disbelief than interest. She turned to meet his eyes directly. "I'm a mechanic," she said evenly. 10 miles from here, Marvin's garage. Now, do you want the help or not?" And with that, she walked back to her truck, leaving Ethan standing in the heat, stunned by the sudden loss of control and completely unaware that the woman who had just offered him help would soon unravel everything he thought he knew about his past, his family, and himself. Jasmine Reed returned with her toolbox in hand, a battered red case covered in faded stickers and smudged fingerprints, the kind that told stories of years spent battling rusted bolts and overheating engines. She knelt beside the Maserati without hesitation, her movements deliberate, methodical, with the kind of confidence that only came from surviving too many days when nothing went right unless you made it right yourself. Ethan watched her arms cross, sweat trickling down his temple, unsure whether he was more irritated by the situation or by the unnerving calm she brought with her. Her hands, small but strong, moved like a surgeon's. No wasted motion, no doubt, as she unscrewed the coolant cap and inspected the reservoir. "Another 5 minutes and you would have blown the entire engine," she murmured, not looking up, her voice flat but edged with something sharper. Not judgment, but certainty. Ethan swallowed his pride, resisting the urge to explain himself. He didn't know why he felt the need to justify being stranded, as if his wealth, his reputation should have been enough to shield him from inconvenience. He cleared his throat, trying to reassert control. "How do you know so much about these models? You don't exactly look like someone who—" He stopped himself, mid-sentence, the implication hanging in the air like static. Jasmine didn't move. She merely tilted her head slightly, her voice cool. Who, what, shouldn't know how to fix a car that costs more than a house? Ethan winced at his own unconscious bias, but before he could speak again, she continued. "I read, I study, I care about what I do. Excellence isn't exclusive to city suits and glass towers, Mr. Cole." The sound of his name on her lips sent a strange ripple through him. He hadn't introduced himself. He narrowed his eyes. "You know who I am?" She gave a half shrug. "Your face is in the business section every other week, Tech Savior of the Year, partnering with the state to build Brighton Hills Innovation Corridor." Ethan nodded slowly, impressed despite himself. She closed the hood with a solid thud, then stepped back. "That should get you into town. Temporarily. You'll need a full fix soon, or you'll burn out the core." He reached into his wallet and pulled out a wad of crisp bills, an automatic gesture the way he always closed transactions. But when Jasmine extended her hand to take them, his eyes fell on it, the flash of silver, the small, deep blue sapphire nestled in an antique ring. Something inside him stopped cold. The world blurred at the edges, time cracking like glass around the moment. That ring. He knew that ring. Not from a catalog, not from a storefront. From memory. From a promise whispered under a tree 2 decades ago. From a child's hand he had held tightly before letting go. "Where did you get that ring?" he asked, his voice lower than he intended, almost hoarse. Jasmine paused, her body instinctively stiffening. She curled her fingers, slightly shielding the ring, without even realizing it. "It was my mother's," she said, cautious now. "Why do you ask?" Ethan opened his mouth, but the words tangled in his throat. He had no way to explain what he was feeling. The sense that the past he had long buried had just climbed out of the earth and was now staring him straight in the face with grease-stained hands and eyes that once belonged to a little girl. He promised he'd come back for, but never did. For a moment, Ethan Cole couldn't breathe. The sapphire on Jasmine's hand was not just a coincidence, not just an heirloom passed down from some forgotten family line. It was the ring. The very one he had seen only once before, 20 years earlier, in a time so distant, it almost felt like a dream. He remembered the way it had shimmered in the sunlight, filtering through the trees of the Open Heart Orphanage in Orion District, the way he had clumsily slipped it onto the finger of a girl with wide, curious eyes and a broken sandal. They had hidden behind the chapel wall, away from the sneers of the other boys, who mocked him for befriending her. That day he had promised her 2 things, that he would come back for her, and that the ring would protect her until he did. Then his father came, took him, changed everything. Jasmine shifted her weight, clearly uncomfortable with his long silence, her eyes studying him now, wary. "Do you know this ring?" she asked slowly, her voice not trembling but far from steady. Ethan struggled to answer. Instead, he pulled out a small object from the inner pocket of his blazer, something he hadn't touched in years, a carved wooden bird, delicate and slightly chipped. "This," he said, extending his palm, "was given to me by someone I once swore I'd never forget." Jasmine's gaze fell on the bird, and her breath caught. The motion was barely perceptible, but Ethan saw it, the way her eyes widened, the way her lips parted ever so slightly, the way her entire presence changed in the span of a heartbeat. "That was mine," she whispered. "I carved it with my Uncle Marvin. It was the only thing I had left of my mother." Her voice faded and a silence bloomed between them, louder than any scream. Ethan nodded once slowly. You gave it to me the night I left. I was crying. You said I had to be brave. Jasmine looked at him as if seeing him for the first time, not as the CEO on magazine covers, but as the lonely boy with unkempt hair and wide, frightened eyes who used to sit beside her under the oak tree reading stories from tattered books. "You're the boy from the orphanage," she murmured, not a question, but a confirmation spoken aloud for herself. Ethan nodded again. "And you're the girl who never stopped waiting, aren't you?" Jasmine didn't reply. Her jaw clenched, her eyes bright, with something that wasn't quite anger, but not forgiveness, either. "I waited," she said finally. "A month, a year, then I stopped. I told myself it was a child's story, a dumb fairy tale." Ethan's shoulders sagged. He had no words, no apology that could fit the wound of 20 years. And yet the universe in its strange cruelty had placed them here, two strangers who were once everything to each other, now bound again by a ring, a wooden bird, and a silence that asked one impossible question. What now? Jasmine turned away from him, not in anger, but in restraint, as if the weight of 20 years was too much to look him in the eye. Her fingers brushed over the sapphire ring, not with pride, but habit, a subconscious gesture carved from years of clinging to something that once meant protection, hope, even love. Ethan stood still, his world tilting in a way that no boardroom disaster or billion-dollar loss had ever managed. This wasn't just a reunion, it was an unraveling. "You disappeared, Ethan," she said quietly, her voice half buried under the roar of cicadas and the distant hum of the highway. "One day you were there reading books with me, helping me fix broken toys, promising me that the world could be different. And the next day, you were gone. No goodbye, no letter, just gone." He opened his mouth to explain, to tell her about the black sedan that came for him, about Richard Cole standing in the orphanage hallway with a forced smile, and a contract about the new house with cold marble floors and colder rules. But the words tasted hollow before they even reached his tongue. "I tried to come back," he said at last. "Weekly I asked about you. They said the files were lost, that the orphanage had been shut down. My father wouldn't give me any answers." Jasmine turned back to him slowly, her eyes no longer soft, but sharp. "You didn't try hard enough. The statement wasn't cruel, it was simply true." Ethan felt it land like a blow. She wasn't wrong. He had let himself be swept away by privileged comfort and a carefully constructed future that demanded he forget where he came from. And he had, until now. "Why are you even here?" she asked suddenly. The question not accusatory but wounded. Why now? Ethan hesitated, then reached into his jacket again, this time pulling out a small folded newspaper clipping. He handed it to her. She unfolded it, and her face stiffened. It was an article from 10 years ago. The headline read, "Brighton Hills Expansion, Coltech, acquires historic land for innovation, corridor." Jasmine stared at the image accompanying it. A green valley being cleared, her childhood home reduced to scaffolding. "This land," she began. Ethan nodded grimly. "It used to belong to your family. I didn't know. Not until I started digging last week. There are contracts, Jasmine, buried documents. And your mother? Angela Reed. She didn't die, did she?" Jasmine's face paled. Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "There's more, Jasmine. My father lied. About everything, about the orphanage, about the land, about your mother. I don't know the whole truth yet, but I swear to you, I'm not walking away this time." Jasmine looked at him, and for the briefest moment, the girl she had once been flickered behind her eyes. But it was gone just as fast. She folded the clipping, slowly slid it into her pocket, and stepped back. "If you really mean that," she said, her voice tight, "then come to Marvin's garage tomorrow. I'll show you something that will change the way you see your father. And yourself." Without another word, she turned and climbed into her truck. The engine sputtered to life, and before he could stop her, she was gone, leaving Ethan alone once more on the boiling asphalt. This time, not just with a broken car, but with the shattering knowledge that his entire life may have been built on someone else's ruin. The next morning, Marvin's garage looked like it always had, worn honest cluttered with broken engines and scattered tools, a place where machines came to be reborn. But today, it felt different. The air was heavier, as if the walls themselves knew that truths buried for decades were about to claw their way into daylight. Ethan pulled up in a nondescript sedan, No bodyguards, no assistants, no designer suit. Just him, a man stripped of image, arriving not as the CEO of Coltech, but as someone desperate to understand the fault lines of his past. Jasmine was already there, hunched over the gutted remains of a carburetor, her hands moving with the kind of rage that had learned to disguise itself as focus. She didn't look up when he entered. "You're early," she said. "Didn't sleep?" he replied. "Didn't think you would." She murmured, wiping her hands on a rag, before motioning him to follow her into a small side office. The space was barely large enough to hold the metal filing cabinet, a workbench, and the heavy silence between them. Jasmine bent down and retrieved a weathered box from beneath the desk, not locked, but sealed by time and reluctance. She placed it gently on the table and opened it. Inside were yellowed papers, folded contracts, notarized land transfers, all stamped with the dark blue emblem of Cole Enterprises. Ethan leaned in his eyes, scanning each page, disbelief turning to nausea as he began to understand. These signatures. "They're my father's," he said quietly. "Every single one." Jasmine nodded. "Your father orchestrated the takeover of our land. He filed a fake death certificate for my mother, then threatened her life if she tried to return, all to get his hands on what he called a worthless valley." Her voice broke slightly on the last word. "Worthless," she repeated bitterly. "Even though it holds the largest freshwater reserve in the region, even though it was our home." Ethan ran a hand down his face, suddenly aware of how deep the rot went. The man who had raised him, who had shaped his future, hadn't just committed fraud, he had destroyed lives. Jasmine pulled out a faded photograph next. It was a picture of her mother, Angela Reed, a graceful woman with calm eyes and the same sapphire ring on her finger. Behind her was the valley, lush and untouched, long before bulldozers carved it apart. "She gave me the ring before they took her." Jasmine said, her voice a whisper. "Now told me to keep it safe. Told me it would bring truth back someday." Ethan stared at the photo, then back at Jasmine. "Do you think she's still alive?" Jasmine hesitated, then nodded slowly. 8 years ago, I got a letter. No return address. But I recognized the handwriting. It was hers. Postmarked from a clinic in New Hope. Ethan straightened, something sharp awakening in him. "Then we find her." Jasmine looked at him, eyes narrowing. "Why do you care now, Ethan? Because you feel guilty? Because you want to clean your family's mess before the press finds out?" He met her gaze without blinking. "Because I should have come back for you? Because you were right. I didn't try hard enough. And because if there's still a way to make any of this right, I have to take it. Not as a Cole, as the boy who made you a promise under that tree." Jasmine stared at him for a long time, then nodded once. "Good. Because tonight your father's unveiling the new corporate complex on that land. And that's where I'm going to tell the world exactly what he did." Ethan felt a chill, despite the summer heat. "He moved the ceremony to tonight. I just found out this morning. Only the executive circle knows." Jasmine raised a brow. "Then it's even better. You'll help me get inside." Ethan paused, then smiled. Not the charming rehearsed one from investor meetings, but something real. "You're serious. Deadly. Then we'd better make it count." And for the first time in 2 decades, they stood side by side again. Not as children with secrets, but as adults with a mission to burn down the lies and raise the truth from the ashes. The event was everything Ethan expected. Grand, pristine, and sterilized to perfection, like a stage play crafted to distract the world from what lay beneath its marble floors. The Coltech Innovation Complex gleamed under thousands of lights as drones hovered above for aerial footage, and photographers circled like moths around the city's elite. Investors, politicians, and media figures filled the plaza, sipping champagne and offering hollow praise to Richard Cole, who stood at the center like a crowned emperor, untouchable, unbothered, unaware of the storm gathering just outside his control. Dressed in a simple suit, Ethan moved through the crowd, with practiced ease offering nods and empty smiles while his mind raced. He had spent the entire day hacking into the event's internal system. He now had access to the AV controls, the security cameras, and, most importantly, the main stage microphone. Jasmine waited in the shadow of a service entrance, dressed in mechanic's black, a duffel bag over her shoulder, and fire in her eyes. "Last chance to back out," Ethan murmured as he approached. "I've waited 20 years, she replied. "This is the backup plan." He handed her an access badge and pointed to a narrow hallway that led to the side of the stage. "I'll cue the lights. You step up when I give the signal." She nodded, then gripped his wrist briefly. "If anything goes wrong, I'll take the fall." Ethan cut in. "I'm done protecting his legacy." A moment later, the orchestra swelled and Richard Cole stepped onto the platform, greeted by thunderous applause. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice rich with practiced charm, "today we celebrate the future." Ethan from behind the AV console pressed a button. The lights flickered, then dimmed. The large screen behind Richard, meant to play a corporate montage, instead went black. For a beat, confusion rippled across the crowd. Then Jasmine stepped into the light. Silence fell like a guillotine. Richard froze, eyes narrowing. "What is she doing here?" he hissed into his earpiece. But his question was already obsolete. Jasmine had the mic. "My name is Jasmine Reed," she said, steady and unshaken. "And before this land became your empire, it was my home. My mother, Angela Reed, was the rightful owner of this valley. She was declared dead by a forged certificate signed by the man standing behind me." Murmurs exploded like wildfire through the crowd. Richard took a step forward, voice low but threatening. "Enough of this. You've made your point. Let's talk in private." Jasmine turned slowly to face him, the lights catching the gleam of her sapphire ring. "No, we've done the silence. We've lived in the shadows of your empire long enough." She turned back to the crowd, raising a stack of yellowed documents in her hand. "These are land deeds stolen under threats, records of intimidation, of fraud, and a signature, his signature on every single one." Ethan watched as the cameras shifted lenses, capturing every second, streaming it live to thousands online. Somewhere in the distance, police radios crackled. "She's lying," Richard barked, his voice losing its polish. "She's trying to extort us." "Then where is my mother?" Jasmine interrupted, her voice rising. "Because if she truly died 20 years ago, you won't mind if we open the Coltech medical records or check the property in New Hope where she was last seen alive." The name hit Richard like a hammer. He staggered just slightly. "You don't know what you're talking about." But he did. And now everyone else did too. Ethan stepped onto the stage beside Jasmine, locking eyes with his father. "She's telling the truth," he said, each word like a crack in the marble beneath them. "And I have the proof." Cameras flashed. Security hesitated. The empire trembled. And Jasmine, for the first time in her life, stood on the land that had once been stolen from her, not as a girl orphaned by corruption, but as the woman who had come back to reclaim her name, her voice, and the justice her family had been denied. The crowd had barely begun to digest Ethan's declaration when a new ripple of motion stirred at the edge of the stage. From the back entrance, escorted by Uncle Marvin, came a woman cloaked in time and silence. Her gray-streaked hair fell over a worn shawl, her steps hesitant but guided by purpose. Jasmine turned toward the movement, and the breath caught in her throat. Her body froze, every muscle seizing in disbelief. The woman approaching had the same eyes she saw in the mirror every morning. Mom Jasmine's voice cracked as the word left her fragile and trembling. The woman stopped in the light, her voice barely above a whisper, but it echoed like thunder, "Jasmine." The crowd seemed to disappear. So did the flashing cameras, the stage, and the CEO beside her. All that remained was a daughter and a mother reunited after 2 decades of forced absence. Jasmine stumbled forward, tears spilling freely, and Angela Reed opened her arms with a sob that had waited 20 years to be released. They collided in an embrace that seemed to stop time, one stitched from pain survival and the desperate need to feel real again. Around them, a hush settled. Even the skeptics were quiet now. Even Richard Cole, who had once believed money could bury truth forever, found himself retreating, but the past had arrived in flesh and blood, and no amount of power could silence it now. "She's alive," Ethan said aloud to the crowd, his voice no longer the voice of a businessman, but of a son who had finally found the key to the locks on his own history. "My father hid her, faked her death, used her land to build this empire." Richard stepped forward, his face pale, sweat gathering at his temples. She was given everything he spat. Security. A life better than she ever had. It was business. It was necessary. "It was a crime," Ethan said sharply, cutting through his father's delusions. "You tore a child from her mother. You forged documents. You blackmailed an entire family." And then from the corner of the crowd, another voice rose. Calm, clipped but dangerous. "I have it all on video. Lauren Chambers." Ethan's former fiancée stepped forward holding her phone, The audio of Richard Cole admitting the false death certificate, the coercion, the manipulation. I thought I was marrying into a legacy. Turns out I was sleeping next to a cover-up. Richard's composure cracked. You recorded me. I recorded justice, she replied coldly. And this is going to the authorities. For the first time, Richard Cole looked afraid. Not losing money, but of losing control. As security approached the stage, Jasmine turned toward the audience once more. This land belonged to my mother, my family. It's not a symbol of innovation. It's a monument to theft. And now, it's time to give it back. Angela, still holding her daughter's hand, nodded. This land was our beginning. Now it will be everyone's future. And somewhere in the crowd, an old man whispered to no one in particular, "That's not a scandal. That's a reckoning." Sirens began to wail in the distance. The truth had finally come home. By the time the police arrived, the applause had already turned into murmurs, the murmurs into whispers, and the whispers into sharp-edged judgment, echoing through the marble atrium of the Coltech complex. Richard Cole stood still at the center of it all, a man once untouchable, now encircled by the very system he had long manipulated, lights from a dozen cameras flashing in his face like a jury without mercy. Officers moved forward, weaving through the crowd. One of them stepped onto the stage, flanked by two others, and addressed Richard without flinching. "Mr. Cole, you are under investigation for fraud, forgery, kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit corporate theft. Please come with us." "For a second!" Richard's arrogance reared back a smirk, dancing at the corner of his mouth, as if this were just another hostile takeover that could be negotiated in a boardroom. "Do you know who I am?" he scoffed, but the officer didn't blink. "We do. That's why you're going with us." The handcuffs clicked around his wrists, steel cutting through silence. The moment was broadcast live across the country, the mighty founder of Coltech Industries being led away, while his son, once heir to the throne, stood beside the very woman his empire tried to erase. Jasmine didn't smile, she didn't gloat. She simply stood firm, her hand still gripping her mother's, her voice steady. The land will be returned, and the complex will be repurposed. Ethan stepped beside her, lifting the microphone. Starting today, the Coltech Innovation Complex will be renamed the Reed Foundation Community Hub, an environmental reserve, a space for education, clean water research, and support for orphaned youth. The announcement sent a gasp through the crowd. Investors stormed out. Journalists scrambled for quotes. But the applause that rose slow and thunderous came not from the rich, but from the people who had once been invisible, workers, townsfolk. Former residents of the valley who had watched their heritage swallowed by cement, Angela Reed wept quietly, not from sorrow, but from release. Marvin stood at the edge of the stage, arms crossed, proud and still. And in that moment, the Reed family, fractured by greed, scattered by lies, stood together again. Lauren Chambers walked past Ethan on her way out, pausing just long enough to meet his eyes. "You did the right thing," she said quietly, "even if it costs everything." He nodded, the weight of truth still heavy, but no longer unbearable. "Some things are worth losing," he replied, "especially when it means finding out who you are." As the sun began to set behind the hills, the same hills once stolen, now slowly reclaimed, a different kind of legacy began to form. Not in money or buildings, but in honesty, redemption, and a reunion that power could never undo. And somewhere inside him, Ethan knew this was only the beginning. In the days that followed the arrest, the world watched the Coltech scandal unravel like a slow public confession. Newspapers ran headlines in bold red tech, giant built on lies land, theft, forgery, kidnapping, the hidden face of Richard Cole. The sapphire ring that exposed a billion-dollar empire. The media frenzy was relentless. Every talk show dissected the fall of the Cole family. Investors withdrew, partners vanished, and lawsuits piled up like a tide swallowing all Richard Cole had built. But amid the collapse, something else began to grow. Jasmine returned to Marvin's garage not as the forgotten mechanic, but as the woman who had dismantled an empire with truth. Her routine resumed: early mornings, oil-stained gloves, and the hum of machines. But there was something different in the air. Respect, gratitude, recognition. Ethan, meanwhile, spent his days in silence and archives. He buried himself in the Reed Foundation, poring over every document that bore his father's name, exposing decades of manipulation beyond even what they had revealed on stage. He hired investigators, pro bono, lawyers, and policy advisors. His mission was no longer expansion. It was restitution. One afternoon, Jasmine stepped into his temporary office, a simple desk set up in the back corner of the garage, and tossed him a dusty metal nameplate that once read, Coltech West Project Manager. It was scorched at the edges, found in a pile of discarded debris. "Thought you'd want a souvenir," she said, smirking faintly. Ethan turned it over in his hands before placing it in the trash. "I'd rather build something worth remembering." Jasmine studied him for a moment, then reached into her pocket and pulled out the old wooden bird, the carving she had once given him as a child. "You still have this?" she asked. "Always," Ethan said. "It reminded me of the boy I was supposed to be." Jasmine leaned against the wall. "You really believed that promise, didn't you? That we'd find each other again?" Ethan looked at her eyes clear. "I stopped believing, until I saw the ring." They shared a quiet smile, not romantic, not nostalgic, but grounded. Forged in fire and time, Angela joined them moments later, holding a folded piece of paper in her hand. "It's the final deed," she said. "The land is legally ours again. Officially, no more courts, no more loopholes." Jasmine stared at the document as if it were a ghost. 20 years, she whispered. "And now, it's just paper." Angela placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Not just paper, Jasmine, closure." They stood in silence for a long moment. 3 lives bound not just by blood, but by survival. Outside the garage, a group of children gathered for a free workshop hosted by the Reed Foundation. They were learning how to fix engines, how to carve wood, how to build things with their hands and their hearts. One of the kids held up a lopsided bird carving, laughing as the wings snapped off. Ethan walked over, kneeling beside the boy. "That's how it starts," he said. "You break it a few times. Then one day, it flies." And as laughter echoed through the open doors of Marvin's garage, it became clear that something remarkable was taking root. Not just justice, not just healing, but legacy, born from truth, guided by hands once forgotten. Night fell gently over Brighton Hills, casting long shadows across the Reed Foundation building, which now stood not as a fortress of profit, but as a sanctuary of truth. Inside the newly renovated main hall, once designed to host tech expos, the walls now bore paintings from orphaned children, hand-carved wood sculptures, and community-built mosaics that whispered of hope. Reclaimed Jasmine stood by a display case near the entrance. Inside, it sat 3 objects: the wooden bird, the final land deed, and the silver sapphire ring, each now preserved behind glass. Not as trophies, but as living evidence that no lie lasts forever. Ethan entered quietly, pausing as he watched her. The exhaustion of the past few weeks clung to both of them like smoke after a fire, but beneath it, a new peace had begun to settle. "That ring," he said. "Stepping closer was the first real thing I ever had. And I didn't even know what it meant." Jasmine turned to him, her expression softer than it had been in years. "It meant everything to me, because it reminded me I wasn't crazy to believe in promises. Even when they got broken." Ethan nodded slowly. "I used to think I was a coal, that I was part of something great, but now I know I was just a replacement. A convenience, a project." Jasmine stepped forward. "No, you were stolen like me, but we're not projects. Ethan, we're people who get back up." The door creaked behind them. Angela entered holding a faded envelope. Her hands trembled slightly. "I found this," she said, handing it to Ethan. "It's the original adoption request, signed by your birth mother." Ethan's throat tightened as he opened the envelope, pulling out the yellowed paper. The name at the bottom read Amelia Reed. He looked up stunned. That's you." Angela nodded, eyes misty. "Before Richard Cole took you, before he changed the paperwork, I was going to adopt you. Legally, I couldn't have 2 children by blood, but I chose both of you. Jasmine by birth and you by heart." Jasmine stared at her mother, then slowly turned to Ethan. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of memories reconnected, full of bloodlines redrawn by something deeper than DNA. "We're siblings," Ethan whispered. "Real ones?" Jasmine gave a small, broken laugh. "Guess we always were. We just didn't have the paperwork." Ethan reached out slowly, placing a hand on the glass case that held the ring. "And that's why this meant something to both of us, because you wore it after her. And I gave it to you without knowing it was coming back home." Angela stepped forward, resting her hands on both their shoulders. "I lost everything once," she said, her voice cracking. "My land, my name, my children. But tonight, I have them all back." Outside, the wind stirred the trees. In the quiet, there were no speeches, no cameras, no crowds. Just three people bound by pain, reconnected by truth, and grounded by a ring that had known even before they did. That family is not just something you're born into. Sometimes it's something that survives the impossible. By the time the world began to move on, the Reed Foundation had already become more than a symbol. It was a lifeline. Water systems were being rebuilt across Brighton Hills, funded not by shareholders, but by reparations from lawsuits Ethan helped pursue against Coltech's former board. Local children now studied engineering and mechanics, not from textbooks but from Jasmine herself, who taught not only with tools, but with stories etched into every callus of her hand. And Ethan, once heir to a fraudulent empire, spent his days quietly cataloging lost files, meeting with other victims of corporate theft, and slowly erasing the last traces of the Cole name from every building, every contract, every monument built on deceit. Yet, despite the victories, there remained one final task: the land behind the foundation. Once lush with trees and a freshwater stream, it had been cleared during Coltech's expansion. What remained was a barren field of dirt and concrete slabs, soulless and dry. Jasmine often stood at its edge, hands folded, unsure whether to weep for what was lost or rebuild what had been taken. It was Ethan who suggested they do both. "Let's plant something," he said one evening as they stood beneath a sky painted orange and gold. Jasmine raised a brow. "Like a tree, like a forest," he replied. "Not just trees. A memorial for everyone who was displaced, everyone who never got a voice." The next day they announced the Field of Voices project, an open land restoration effort with each tree planted in honor of a lost home, a silenced name, a stolen promise. Letters poured in, volunteers arrived from across the state, and on the first planting day, Angela stepped forward with a small sapling in her arms, a golden maple, the same kind that once stood behind the orphanage. She planted it with her bare hands, whispering a name as she pressed soil around its base. Hope. Jasmine planted the second tree, etching a small wooden plaque beside it, for the land they tried to erase, and Ethan, with dirt on his palms and tears in his eyes, planted the third. For the children who were taken but found their way home, dozens followed, and as each tree took root, something in the town changed, as if the land itself had exhaled, as if the truth, after years buried beneath concrete and contracts, had finally been given room to grow. That night under the stars, Jasmine stood beside Ethan once more. "Do you think this is what redemption feels like?" she asked. He looked at her eyes soft. "No," he said. "This is what belonging feels like." And in that quiet, surrounded by saplings that would one day become giants, they stood not as victims of the past, but as architects of something new. 1 year later, the valley had transformed. What was once scarred land, stripped bare by greed, now swayed with rows of young trees that reached hopefully toward the sky. The Field of Voices had become more than a memorial. It was living proof that truth, when rooted deeply enough, could grow into something stronger than steel and more lasting than gold. Children ran freely through the garden paths. Families picnicked under the shade of saplings that bore names of those once silenced, and at the center a stone fountain whispered gently, its water drawn from the natural spring. Richard Cole once sought to own, carved into its base were the words, "Truth restores all things." Jasmine stood beside it that morning, wiping her hands on a cloth after replacing a broken valve. Her overalls were still streaked with grease, but now she wore them like armor. A group of children was gathered nearby, listening as Uncle Marvin taught them how to sand a block of wood into something useful, something beautiful. Ethan approached from behind carrying a folder. "The state just approved the last petition," he said, offering it to her. "The orphanage records. Everything was sealed and stolen. They're opening the files." Jasmine took the folder, her breath catching. "So every kid who thought they were lost will finally know who they are." Ethan finished quietly. A moment passed. Then he pulled a chain from around his neck, revealing the small wooden bird she had once carved for him. "I want you to have this back." Jasmine smiled, placing her hand over his. "No, it was yours when we were children. Now it's yours because you earned it." From behind them, Angela Reed emerged carrying lemonade, her steps slower but her spirit stronger. "I've never been prouder," she said, her voice soft but filled with light. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver ring, the sapphire gleaming in the morning sun. "I think it's time this belonged to the future," she added, holding it out. Ethan stepped back, shaking his head. "That ring saved us. It should stay with you." Jasmine met her mother's eyes, then took the ring, gently cradling it like a vow. "No," she said, "it didn't save us. We saved ourselves." The ring just remembered who we were before we forgot. As they stood beneath the growing canopy, a breeze rolled through the valley, rustling leaves that now bore names once erased from history. The town that had once turned a blind eye now celebrated the truth it had buried. Schools taught the real story. The Reed Foundation expanded to 6 more cities, and the Coltec name was quietly removed from every public building, replaced by plaques, honoring families who had been silenced for decades. Ethan legally changed his name to Ethan Reed. He no longer needed to wear a name that had never truly been his. And when asked in an interview why he gave up the billions, he simply replied, "Because I'd rather be whole than rich." Jasmine now, a leader in both the foundation and her garage, never stopped fixing things. Not just engines, but people. Teenagers came to her to learn more than mechanics. They came to learn courage. They came to learn how a mechanic with a sapphire ring took down a billionaire with a lie. And every year, on the same spring day, the entire town gathered to plant a new tree in the field of voices, each one bearing witness to the simple truth that once changed everything. Family is not just who we're born to. It's who shows up when the world tries to forget us. Sometimes justice doesn't come in the courtroom. Sometimes it arrives through the hands of a forgotten mechanic, a ring passed down with love, and a truth no empire could silence. Jasmine didn't just repair engines, she restored history. And Ethan didn't just lose a name, he found a family. In a world built on appearances and power, they proved that what truly matters can't be stolen, bought, or buried. It can only be reclaimed if the story touched your heart, if you believe in truth, in second chances, and in the quiet strength of those society often overlooks. Then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And tell us in the comments, have you ever uncovered a truth that changed everything? We'd love to hear your story. Because at Flow Story, we don't just tell stories, we remember the ones the world tried to forget.